Thanks for checking out my presentation. The topic is fast Byzantine agreement for permissioned distributed ledgers. So given a distributed system that is in charge of maintaining a distributed ledger, the goal is to reach consensus as quickly as possible, even in the presence of malfunctioning or malicious nodes. Let's get started with a quick overview of the model. As I just mentioned, we have a distributed system. Unlike in permissionless systems where effectively everybody can host a node, the nodes in a permission system are often managed and controlled by certain companies or institutions. Moreover, all nodes know about each other and each node is equipped with a private-public key pair so that all communication can be authenticated. We assume that each node continuously obtains fresh transactions from some external source, and the goal is now to add valid transactions to the distributed ledger that the nodes maintain. The challenge here is to ensure that the nodes maintain identical copies of the ledger. While this is somewhat of a controlled environment, there is still a need for a consensus protocol that can handle node failures and arbitrary faulty behavior. First of all, even if there is no intent to do harm, a faulty node that behaves erratically might disturb the whole system and cause a liability issue for the owner. And second, if the consensus protocol is robust, the shared owners of the system do not need to fully trust each other. So a consensus protocol that can handle at least some Byzantine nodes brings clear benefits in this scenario. Okay, having an understanding of the model, let's talk about the concrete goal. We measure the quality of our consensus algorithm in the expected number of communication rounds that are needed to reach consensus. Two things are worth pointing out here. If we aim for an algorithm that reaches consensus in a constant number of rounds, it must be a probabilistic algorithm. So there is no absolute certainty that consensus will be reached quickly, but we can guarantee a constant number of rounds in expectation. Second, it is hard to ensure that nodes all reach consensus in the same round. So what we measure here is actually the expected number of rounds until the last honest node reaches a decision. A node that is not faulty is called honest. On the x-axis, we indicate the fraction of Byzantine nodes, that is, the nodes that are potentially faulty or malicious. Our expectation is that a lower fraction of Byzantine nodes entails that consensus can be reached faster. This is important because in a controlled permission environment, the number of Byzantine nodes is likely to be low, as argued before. So, how many rounds should it take? It is clear that one round is enough if there are no faults at all. But as soon as we have some Byzantine nodes, it is easy to see that we cannot guarantee consensus in a single communication round. At the very least, we need to exchange the received information with other nodes to see what they received before making a decision. So it appears that reaching consensus will cost us at least around 2 rounds. Of course, there are more formal arguments which can be found in the paper. If we look at the state of the art, what is the best result? In a recent paper from 2019, it was shown that consensus can be reached in 9 rounds in expectation even if less than 50% of all nodes are Byzantine nodes. The number of rounds even goes down to 5 as we reduce the fraction of Byzantine nodes. Note that we focus on the number of rounds until the last honest node decides rather than when the last honest node terminates. Since the last round is used to inform the other nodes in this algorithm and the paper focuses on termination, the number in the paper is actually 10 and not 9. As mentioned before, we do not necessarily need to be able to handle almost 50% of Byzantine nodes. Can we restrict ourselves to lower fractions of Byzantine nodes in order to get a lower number of rounds? This is exactly what this work is about. As we can see here, our new protocol can only handle less than 25% of Byzantine nodes, but it reaches consensus in at most 3 rounds. If the number of Byzantine nodes goes to 0, the number of rounds goes down to 2, which is exactly our goal. So the number of rounds is very low in expectation, which is great because a low number of rounds translates to high efficiency in terms of attainable throughput. The consensus algorithm actually has another strength, which is its simplicity. If the algorithm is simple, it is easier to implement correctly. In fact, it is simple enough so that we can quickly go through the base protocol in the next couple of minutes. The first stage of the algorithm is the proposal stage. In the proposal stage, a single node is considered the leader. So this is a leader-based protocol. The leader for each execution of the algorithm is chosen pseudo-randomly so that every node knows who the leader is without any communication. The leader takes some of the transactions that it received from some external source and creates the batch of transactions that should be committed to the ledger next. It then broadcasts the batch of transactions to all other nodes. Every honest node only waits for the proposal from the leader and silently discards all other messages that it receives. If it receives a batch from the leader, it endorses this batch, which means that it supports this proposal and tries to get it accepted. If it does not receive a batch from the leader, it endorses the empty set, indicating that the node proposes to end this execution without appending any transactions to the ledger. This is already the complete first stage. The second stage of the algorithm is called attempt to decide. In this stage, every node broadcasts the batch that it currently endorses, and each node collects all the endorsements. Now, if an honest node receives a batch at least n-f times, where n is the total number of nodes and f is the number of Byzantine nodes, it decides on this batch. So, as we can see, the nodes can already decide after the second communication round. In fact, it is easy to see that all honest nodes always decide after the second communication round, deterministically, if the leader is honest. This is true because an honest leader broadcasts the proposal to every node. So every honest node will broadcast it in the second round. And every honest node will receive the batch from every honest node, which means it is received at least n-f times. As usual for leader-based protocols, it only gets more complicated if the leader is Byzantine. Byzantine leaders are handled in the third stage. The third stage can take two forms. Did the honest nodes reach a decision in stage 2 or not? In either case, the protocol continues at least for another round, which again starts with every node broadcasting the batch that it endorses. If a node reached a decision in stage 2, it simply terminates after informing all the other nodes about its decision. This node will no longer participate in the execution of the algorithm after this round. As you can guess, the only tricky case is when a node did not decide in stage 2. In this case, it counts again the number of endorsements. If the number is still below n-f, then it carries out a shared coin toss and checks if the result is tails. If it is, it starts endorsing the empty set. Otherwise, it endorses the batch that most nodes endorse. So when the nodes broadcast their endorsements in this round, they further exchange some data that they use to compute the outcome of a shared coin toss. There are Byzantine fault-tolerant shared coin protocols that require only a single communication round, which can be plugged in here. Concrete protocols are referenced in the paper. Every honest node that does not terminate at the end of this round executes stage 2 again, trying again to decide, and then executing stage 3 again, and so on, until a decision is reached. This is already the full protocol. Having seen the full protocol, let's look at some of the main results. The first result is that 2 rounds suffice to reach consensus if the leader is honest. This is very easy to see, as we essentially proved it when discussing the second stage of the algorithm. The second result that I want to mention here is that the expected number of rounds is at most 3 if f is lower than n/4. We will not prove this statement here, the details are in the paper. So, as we can see, the expected number of rounds is between 2 and 3, as we discussed at the beginning of this presentation. I also mentioned that we only looked at the basic version of the protocol. there are some interesting variants, one of which I'd like to briefly introduce next. The variant that I'd like to introduce briefly is the reference-based variant. The proposal that the leader broadcasts in the first stage might be quite large, as it may contain hundreds or thousands of transactions. Obviously, having all nodes broadcast the full batch in every message wastes a lot of bandwidth. In the reference-based variant, after having received the full batch, the nodes derive or compute a reference to this batch. A simple example would be a hash of the batch data, which is typically much smaller than the actual batch. The nodes then broadcast the reference in all subsequent messages, as opposed to sending the full batch. While this optimization seems rather obvious, it is actually not as simple as it may appear. What happens if Byzantine nodes make the honest nodes accept an invalid reference? What if only some honest nodes obtain the full batch? In this case, the honest nodes need to reach consensus whether the reference is actually associated with a proper transaction set and ensure that all honest nodes obtain it. The variant presented in the paper can resolve these issues, guaranteeing the same bounds on the expected number of rounds. Let's briefly discuss why this variant is interesting. One of the primary requirements for a distributed ledger system is scalability. That is, performance should not deteriorate much if the number of nodes in the system increases. This is a challenging requirement for Byzantine consensus protocols because they typically require many broadcast rounds. However, if we combine two tricks, we can, at least in theory, achieve a high level of scalability. The first trick is to use multicast so that every node always sends every message only once. The multicast-enabled routers make sure that all nodes receive a copy of the message. Note that we can also use multicast in global permission systems if we place all nodes in a shared virtual network. Obviously, it would be very hard to use multicast in a permissionless system. The second trick is to use the reference-based variant. If the full batch is large enough, the exchanged references together are still smaller than the full batch, so most bandwidth is actually used to distribute the full batch. Moreover, since the expected number of rounds is small, the execution of the algorithm also will not take much longer than the distribution of the batch. So the conclusion is that this combination results in a fairly scalable system. We implemented the reference-based variant in order to test its performance in practice. This graph shows the main results. As you can see, we looked at distributed systems of size 5, 10, 15, and 20. Each node ran on a different physical machine in a compute cluster. The y-axis shows the performance in terms of throughput, that is, how many megabytes of transaction data can be committed per second. We compared our system against BFT Smart, a fairly optimized state replication framework. Our system is called PAR for propose, attempt to decide, and randomize. We varied the batch size to find out which size results in the best performance. As the graph shows, our system, in all cases, achieves a better throughput. When using the best batch size, it outperforms BFT Smart by a factor of roughly 2.5. One thing that I don't like very much about the plot is that the scalability is only okay in my opinion. I expected a much slower degradation as the number of nodes increases. I'm actually quite sure that an optimized implementation can achieve a much better scalability for the reasons discussed before. In any case, this is an exciting direction for future research. Having briefly looked at the base protocol, the reference-based variant, and some results of our practical evaluation, let me stress again that there are more interesting things in the paper, so I definitely recommend that you check it out. You will find the base protocol in section 4 in the paper. I haven't mentioned it explicitly, but we always assume the synchronous communication model, where all messages are guaranteed to arrive in a fixed time interval. What if this assumption is too strong? A variant for the partially synchronous model can be found in the paper in section 5.1. If you're interested in the details of the reference-based variant, you can find them in section 5.2. Finally, the preliminary results of the practical evaluation, which also go a bit beyond what I presented just a minute ago, can be found in section 6. Alright, this brings me to the end of this presentation. I hope that you found it interesting and are now eager to look more deeply into the paper. If you have any questions or comments, please feel free to send me an email. Thanks for listening.